Welcome to a Kickstarter success story. Two Studios originally advertised Ravaged as a game without publisher restrictions. Awarded funds by May 20th, the developers promised something fun, new and unique, a game that required skill and teamwork, with high fidelity graphics and vehicles that would take skill to control. Since release, however, Two Studios haven't exactly done a stellar job at marketing their product because, well, there's only about one server and it's only half full, and that's the demo server that anyone can play on. That doesn't mean it's a bad game though, but the anti-evil publisher rhetoric the game was marketed under seems to have had an ironic backlash, with no real financial push to get the games into the eyes of the gamers. That would explain the total of 9 players on at any one time. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad game. It's not, and it really does deserve a look in. Ravaged uses the Unreal 3 engine, an engine popular with small studios and indie developers, but it doesn't look like an Unreal 3 engine title. The game has a masterfully crafted aesthetic that far surpasses the console ports of late, and it arguably looks better than most of the AAA first-person shooters popular at the moment. I was surprised when I actually had to turn some settings down in a game to get it to run at 60 frames per second. Not because the game is poorly coded, but because my rig actually wasn't up to it. Featuring 28 weapons, 8 large maps, 10 character classes and 10 vehicles, Ravaged has a lot of content for your money, but it feels like some kind of odd Battlefield mod. But I can't help but feel as though the team had real talent to make something different. A multiplayer online shooter, Ravaged features, at least on paper, the same kind of point capture or capture the flag game modes that we're used to from the modern military shooter subgenre. But with the addition of some cool Mad Max style vehicles, driving around has the potential to play more like Unreal Tournament 2004 than it does Battlefield, where often vehicles are just a quick way for getting from A to B. The key word is potential, because Ravaged really doesn't live up to it. And although the vehicles are awesome, the self-styled team gameplay doesn't carry through to the game itself. Whilst there are vehicles designed for one person, people often just run to the nearest car or the nearest truck and head to the nearest point, ditching the car. Yeah, the exact same problems we faced with the aforementioned games. And with the driver unable to shoot, unless you're in one of the helicopters, that means teammates are often driving out to their deaths, ready to be picked off by one of the enemy support classes. It's not the developer's fault, but it's an inescapable fact of the gameplay, and one problem among many others. In the end, and I'm sure the lack of real community or players exacerbates this, it does become a sort of the worst gameplay of Battlefield type situation, with people driving around ignoring objectives and 1v1 skirmishes that really just amount to predicting whether or not the opponents are going to strafe left or right. Ravaged is certainly created with a lot of knowledge and a lot of love, and those looking for a visually exciting experience are certainly not going to be sorry. In fact, they've nailed the cartoony post-apocalyptic aesthetic much better, in my opinion, than Rage, mixing high sharpness and detail with light, colourful aesthetic that isn't too serious and depressing, but it still oozes authenticity and detail. But without digressing too much into the graphics and sounding like an HD whore, how does it actually play? The maps are split into control points where players need to capture the resource, which is the flag, and in between is basically a sparse nothingness where you either search for a vehicle or die horribly. The maps, though, were very well designed for vehicular combat, and the real-life inspiration really carries across into the sparse and vanquished tomorrow. The problem is, with all their talk of original gameplay, Ravage basically entails everyone running into a vehicle, driving to the enemy area, jumping out of the vehicle, and killing each other until something is accomplished. If you drive off in a 3 or 4 seater vehicle, you're probably just going to die, because you've got no one to shoot for you. If you're lucky, someone will spawn on you, but it's best to load up vehicles with players before you head out. The vehicles are well styled and potentially fun to drive. A few quirks ruin it, such as the Jeep having a wider turning girth than the diameter of a whirlpool in a fantasy adventure, but they genuinely feel like Mad Max inspired vehicles. It'd be nice to see some destruction elements instead of them just blowing up. Each faction has its own helicopter, and this serves as a great example of just how hard Two Dawn tried to convince us that this is a game about skill. Both the helicopters have horrendous controls, and whilst you might say, well hey buddy, you just need more practice, I can tell you that I can fly them pretty well. I mean, take a look at this.
lost a base! Capturing base!
This isn't something that players who play at a high DPI or sensitivity are going to want to do, because the tiniest of corrections seem to send you flying backwards or forwards to your death. I'm not falling for it, Tudorn. These aren't good controls that take a while to learn. They're bad controls that just need getting used to. And that's something of a trend in this game, even though the emphasis was on skill. The sensitivity of the helicopter controls, focusing on the difficulty of flight, means it's incredibly difficult to aim, since your sight is fixed to wherever you're steering. Naturally, the players will be on the ground, and if you point even slightly towards the floor, you'll start heading forward quicker than a 12-year-old on a Call of Duty launch night. Speaking of factions, the game has two of them, the Resistance and the Scavengers, which makes the game basically a sort of police versus bandits thing. Adding to their cool characters' appeal, each faction has a choice of class which features its own unique character. These characters are indeed varied, and if you take them out of Ravaged and shove them into, say, Left 4 Dead, you'd probably have characters worthy of some fanfiction and fan art. In other words, they'd be quite popular. And that's the thing with Ravaged, where it excels in art design, it falls short in concept, which is a very safe, very generic first-person shooter, despite promising to be anything but generic. Their initial Kickstarter pledge laid out exactly why Tudorn Studios thought that this title differed from mainstream first-person shooters. Their examples were that vehicles were fun to drive, it had cool characters, some crazy melee combat, vehicles and weapons required skill to use, and some other more generic ones. Post-launch, what I can say for certain is that Ravaged doesn't feel unique in any way, shape or form. Whilst it doesn't feel bad in any way, weapons certainly don't require any godly skill to use properly. They all look very pretty, but with very limited recoil and some not so fantastic sound, they're not hugely meaty. Although the class-specific weaponry is balanced appropriately for the gameplay, there's not much variation between the guns. Assault rifles are all as good as each other, apart from the ridiculous sight on the M16, which makes the AK a far better choice, although it's only a scavenger weapon, and the sniper rifles pop like a BB gun, with very limited bullet drop. I mean shit, even the crossbow is a cakewalk. Not to mention the harpoon gun. Truthfully, combat is easy, and the weapons, despite Tudorn claiming otherwise, require only basic hand-eye coordination. Although Ravaged is relatively bug-free, it does include some horrible texture pop-in and problems prone to the Unreal 3 engine, and apparently they have the same problems with ladders that Bethesda have. But for the most part, the game is pretty much bug-free. Really, Ravaged feels like a valiant attempt to make a game that the developers would enjoy, and that's exactly what they set out to do. The problem is that not everyone plays like they do, over their own network, in a LAN, and Ravaged feels like it was made for a more social experience. I can really see this title flourishing in a LAN environment, just as other vehicular combat games have in the past. But in its current state, with less players than an outdoor bowls park in a Siberian winter, there's no reason to really buy it. You can play the demo yourself, with people who own the game, and I've been playing the exact same content they have, and I paid for it. Sure, there are more maps to try, and each of them are as beautiful as the ones before it, but is it really worth checking out just to load up a server on your own? Ravaged is a potentially lonely experience, but at an indie price, it's worth picking up for some LAN, or if you're in a gaming community where you can orchestrate your own games. A somewhat generic first-person shooter with some neat ideas and a cool aesthetic, I can't help but feel as though mimicking the Battlefield 3 game type isn't such a great idea, given that, well, Battlefield 3 still exists. It's similar enough to feel familiar and entertaining, but too similar in the fact that it shot itself in its own foot. I can't tell you to go out and buy it, but I can tell you to download the demo, because that's free, and Tudorn at least deserve a look in.